For topic two, we're going to look at the rules for adding integers. You've already seen generally how addition of integers works using a number line. Now we're just going to look at the basic rules, which are going to, truthfully, they're going to be a little bit easier for us to use because a lot of the numbers we're going to work with are going to be big enough that using a number line might not make a whole lot of sense. So let's go ahead and look at this. When you add integers, there are basically two situations that can come up. Sometimes I'll call them cases. So we could say case one and then case two. Whatever works for your brain, go with it. So the first situation or the first case, there's a moth again. It's late at night. Well, not late, but it's nighttime and the doors are open, so the bugs are coming in. All right, so case one, we have a situation where you're adding integers that have the same sign. Okay, so you're adding two negatives or you're adding two positives. Okay, so technically what we do is we add the absolute values of the two numbers and then keep whatever sign we had to begin with. So if we're adding two numbers that are positive, we add the absolute values. That's just going to keep them positive. And then the result stays positive. If you're adding two numbers that are negative, you technically add the absolute values, and then you just keep the result negative. So essentially, in short, you add and keep the common sign. So you can see I have an example of each situation. Positive 15 plus positive 6, that is just regular old addition. That's what we're used to, okay? So we would add 15 and 6, we get 21. Since we have 15, which is positive, and we're adding more positive to it, the result is just going to be even more positive, if that makes sense. Now, for the negative example, we have negative 12 plus negative 13. Technically, what we're doing is we're adding the absolute values. So the absolute value of negative 12 is 12. The absolute value of negative 13 is 13. We want to take 12 and add it to 13, which gives us 25. But since both numbers were negative to start, we want our result to be negative. Okay, so you can kind of think of it as we had some negative, we added more negative to the pile, so we have an even bigger pile of negative, if that makes sense. Okay. Now, in a situation where your signs are different, you have to be a little bit more careful here. So if you're adding two numbers with different signs, that means one is positive and one is negative. You want to subtract the absolute values. So you're going to subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value. And then the result takes the sign of the integer with the larger absolute value. That's a lot of words, okay? So when I get into this and actually practice it, I'll kind of explain it a little differently for each example. But essentially what you do is you just subtract the two numbers. So again, you're technically subtracting the absolute values. And then you ask yourself, what did I have more of? Did I have more positive or did I have more negative? Whatever you had more of to begin with is going to be the results, or is going to be the sign on the final result, okay? So for example here, we have negative 20 plus 14. So we're technically going to subtract the absolute value. So that would be 20 minus 14. That is just 6. But notice I had more negative. So if you think of these negatives as things, I have 20 negatives and I only have 14 positives. That tells me I have more negatives. Therefore, my final answer has to be negative. Okay? Now, for the next example, we have 32 plus negative 12. Well, you would subtract your absolute value. So you take 32, you subtract 12, that gives you 20. But then you have to ask yourself, what did I have more of? I had 32 positives, but I only had 12 negatives. That tells me the positives are going to kind of take over, and that's going to become the sign on my final answer. Okay, so with all that said, let's go ahead and practice. So example 2 says find each sum, and we have 4 parts to example 2, okay? So for part A, we have negative 175, and we're going to add positive 261. So we are adding two numbers that have different signs, okay? So when you have different signs, you subtract. You want to find the difference in the positive and the negative. Well, the absolute values are 175 and 261. 261 is definitely bigger, so I want to start with 261. And I want to subtract 175. Subtract just like always, like normal subtraction here. So I cannot take 5 from 1, so I would need to borrow. 6 becomes 5, 1 becomes 11. 11 minus 5 is 6. Now I would need to take 7 from 5, but I can't, so I borrow again. 2 becomes 1, 5 becomes 15. 15 minus 7 is 8. And then 1 minus 1 is just 0, but I don't put a 0 in front of the number here. So we know our sum is going to be 86, but is it going to be positive or is it going to be negative? So ask yourself, what did I have more of? That's really technically saying which had the larger absolute value. So we have 175 negatives, but we had 261 positives. We had more positives than negatives. That tells me my final answer is positive 86. Okay. Now, I will say when you have a positive sum, you don't have to put the plus in front of it. I put the plus there just to make it really clear to you all it's positive. But just know a positive number, you don't put anything in front of it. The negative number, you do have to put the negative in front. Okay. So let's look at our next example. So for part B, we have negative 316 plus 179. So which of these numbers has the bigger absolute value? Definitely 316. So we would take 316 and subtract 179. We're going to subtract column by column, just like always. So I cannot take 6 from 9, or I cannot take 9 from 6. Almost screwed up there. So we're going to borrow. 1 becomes 0, 6 becomes 16. And I can take 9 from 16. I would get 7. Okay? Now I cannot take 7 from 0, so I would borrow again. 3 becomes 2, 0 becomes 10. And now 10 minus 7 is 3. And then finally, 2 minus 1 is 1. So we know our final answer is going to have a 137 in it, but is it positive or is it negative? Well, I have 316 negatives, but I only have 179 positives. I have way more negatives than I have positives. So that negative is going to take over the final answer, and my final sum is going to be negative 137. Okay. Now, when it comes to stuff like this, the question is so frequently, can we use calculators or not? For something really basic like this, I would prefer you do this by hand. You need to practice. You need to have a general understanding of how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide by hand. There will be some type of assessment in my class where I want you to do things by hand, okay? Now, if you are just determined to use a calculator, you got to show me something. You got to show me some kind of side work at some point, okay? So I would say for adding and subtracting integers, we really need to stick with doing it by hand because there's not a lot of work to show me here, okay? So I prefer addition and subtraction to be done by hand. If you're doing a word problem that has some really crazy numbers or a lot of numbers where you're adding a list of numbers, a calculator would be appropriate. But just adding and subtracting a couple of numbers, do it by hand, okay? Now, part C, we have negative 1,268 plus negative 2,509. We're adding two numbers with the same sign. So we want to go ahead and add. We've got some negative. We're adding more negative to it. Okay. So off to the side, we're going to add 1,268 and 2,509. We're going to add column by column again. Why not do it by hand? It doesn't take that long. 8 plus 9 is 17, so I keep a 7. I carry a 1. 0 plus 6 plus 1 is 7. 5 plus 2 is 7. And 2 plus 1 is 3. So my final answer is definitely 3,777. But is it positive or is it negative? Well, I had negative and I added more negative to it, so I have like a whole bunch of negatives. So my final answer is going to remain negative. So you add two numbers with the same sign, you add and keep the sign. Okay? And finally, I saved the easiest one for last here. We're adding two positive numbers. This is what we're accustomed to. We know how to add two positive numbers. We just add them and the result stays positive. So off to the side, we've got 422 plus 638. 2 plus 8 is 10, so I keep a 0. I carry a 1. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is what? 5, 6. And then 4 plus 6 is 10. So we're going to end up with positive 1,060. And there you have it. That is adding integers. So again, if you're adding two numbers with the same sign, add, keep whatever the sign is. If you're adding two numbers with different signs, that's when you subtract and you figure out what did I have more of to begin with. That's going to remain the sign on your final answer. Okay, now one more example for this. We're going to look at adding a series of numbers. Now, these are all 1 and 2 digit numbers. So this is another situation where you might as well just do this by hand. It's going to take you not that much longer to do it by hand than use a calculator. So something like this would be very reasonable for you to do by hand. Okay, so if you are adding or subtracting, we'll see that later in the next section, but if you're adding or subtracting a series of numbers, you can do it two different ways. So in this case, because we're adding, the first way you can do it is just add 2 by 2. So add the first two, drop down the next one, add it, drop down the next one, add it. So you just kind of keep adding. Okay. The other way you can do it is you can group numbers that have the same sign. So you can group all of your negatives together, add those, group all of your positives together, add those, and then at the end find the difference in the positive and the negative. Whichever one you prefer is fine. I don't totally have a preference, so I'll show you both methods here. So for the first one, I'll show you just kind of adding in a row. The second one, I'll show you how we can group them. Okay. So for part A, example 3 just says find each sum. And for part A, we have -2 plus +3 plus -1 plus -5. So when I do this, where I just sort of add from left to right, I'll kind of group the first two. And so I have -2 plus 3. Well, with -2 plus 3, I'm adding two numbers with a different sign. So I would subtract. 3 minus 2 is 1, but then we have to ask ourselves, is it positive or is it negative? I only have two negatives, but I have three positives. So I have more positive than negative. So this is going to be +1. And then for me, I like to just bring down the rest of the problem so I make sure I don't forget anything. And then I add the next two, or the first two in the next row. So here I have 1 plus -1. Well, let's see, 1 plus -1, we're adding two numbers with different signs, so we technically subtract. So 1 minus 1 is just 0, and that should kind of make sense. If you have one thing and you take that one thing away, you're left with nothing. So here we get 0, and then we want to drop down the next digit in line. 0 plus -5 is just -5. And you can kind of envision that, like if you had a number line, we are here at 0. We need to add -5 to it. So that tells me to move to the left. So 1, 2, 3, 4, -5. So we would end up getting -5 as our final sum. So that is one way you can add a series of integers. Just kind of go from the left to the right, going two by two. So adding two of the integers at a time. Okay. Now, for part B, I'll show you the other method. One other way you can do this is you can group all of your positives, and then you can group all of your negatives, add each of those by sign, and then at the end, find the difference in the positive and the negative. If I were to do that, I need to make note of what is positive and what is negative, obviously. So I'll underline all of the numbers that are positive. So we have three numbers that are positive, so I'll add those first. Remember, addition is commutative. It does not matter the order you add in, okay? We could add these in any order we want, and we would all get the same answer. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this as 10 plus 9 plus 6. And then for the second half, we have the two negative numbers. We have -14 plus -3. So what I'll do is I'll add the positives, and then I'll add the negatives separately. And then at the end, we'll find a final sum, okay? So with adding numbers that have the same sign, you just add, okay? So for 10 plus 9 plus 6, we have 10 plus 9, which hopefully we know is 19. And then we have 19 plus 6, so 9 plus 6 is 15. I keep a 5, I carry a 1. So we have positive 25. So when we add up all of the positives, we have 25 total. Now we want to add up the negatives. So remember, when you're adding two numbers that have the same sign, whether they are positive or negative, you add. So you kind of add the absolute values. So we want to take 14 and add 3. Well, 14 plus 3 is 17, but the two numbers were negative to begin with. So this becomes -17. So we have 25 plus -17. We're finally adding two numbers that have different signs. That tells me I need to subtract. So we have 25 minus 17. A lot of you can do this one in your head, and if you can, that's fantastic. If not, do the side work. So I cannot take 7 from 5, so I need to borrow. 2 becomes 1, 5 becomes 15. 15 minus 7 is 8, and then 1 minus 1 is 0, but I don't actually put the 0 in front of the 8. So I know my sum is going to be an 8, but is it positive or is it negative? Well, how much positive do we have? We had 25 positive. We only had 17 negative, so we have more positive. So that tells me my final answer is going to be +8. Okay, so there you have it. That is adding integers. It's not the hardest thing you're ever going to do. You have to remember two things. Same sign, add and keep the sign. Different signs, subtract and keep the larger sign, or the sign of the larger absolute value. Okay, make sure you practice this. It's really important that you're really comfortable, we'll say, at adding integers, because in the next section, when we subtract integers, you need to know how to add. It kind of comes back, it'll come back into that process too. All right, last video for this section, we'll do applications.